Hi, I'm Nimrod Chappell. I'm president of the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP and the Jefferson City NAACP. It's my pleasure and proud honor to share with you, in preparation for this Juneteenth festivity, some of the background about where we've been and where we hope to go. Juneteenth, as you already know, is a day of celebration and jubilee, where a people were freed or got news of their freedom. But I want to talk to you today about part of the struggle of being free and remaining free. We live in Missouri. As you know, it's the first state to have enacted a Jim Crow warning, one to say that there is a travel advisory in the state of Missouri. It was imposed in 2017 and remains in effect today. The purpose of this travel advisory is to let people know the danger that they are in, so that you don't come to Missouri or live here in Missouri and think that for some moment you might be able to avoid not just the vagaries of the indignities related to being Black or a person of color, but the outright danger. Let me be clear. There are people who, such as Tory Sanders, have taken a wrong turn into Missouri and been killed, even though they've never been charged with a crime. They were taken to a jail cell, held for hours and hours, beaten, tased, and pepper sprayed, and later died. Their prosecutors, their torturers, their tormentors, not through the court system, but just through brute force, were law enforcement that day in Mississippi County in Missouri. Tory Sanders died on May the 5th, several years ago, and there has been no justice. The attorney generals refused to prosecute the case, and people ask why I bring that up. Why is that important? It's a sad story about one man, but I think that it shows a glimpse into the lives of what could be the death of any African American in the state. We've seen through the killing of Mike Brown, the Stockley verdict, and you could name many, many more throughout the state, where those folks who kill Black people are not being held accountable. That is the beginning and the end of Jim Crow justice. Two systems of justice for what should be one people. We also know that the traffic report stop that most recently came out, offered through the Attorney General's office, shows that over the last 2 decades, traffic stops have increased for African Americans. But in 2020, even during a pandemic, we were 72 or 73% more likely to be stopped as we went to the essential jobs to keep the rest of our society going. There is a two-stage system of justice at work in Missouri, and we, Black people, brown people, poor people, are the victims of that system. It seeks to steal our dignity and dehumanize us, creating false narratives about this action or this conduct that occurred or didn't occur, even when video cameras, such as in Tory Sanders' case, and many others, have been turned off, removed, or, as in Jeff City, simply don't exist. Why we would expect law enforcement to participate in the modern world of policing without relevant tools. This is not some newfangled technology. It's a video camera that they strap to the chest and to the car of law enforcement to keep them safe and to keep the public safe and to gain trust when we're asking questions about what happened on that dark night or that sad day. It's the least that we should expect, and the very least that a citizenry should be offered for payment of their taxes. But we also see that the health disparities that have been endemic to Black people are not just limited to Missouri, but have been personified here. Because when the pandemic hit, when that European traveler who was returning from a European trip hit St. Louis and brought some of that virus with him, we know that we were the first to die, and we're still dying. COVID-19 has been a sad reflection on a failing medical system, one that has created disparities for minorities and failed to alleviate the pain of groups of people suffering, not by their own hand, but by the works of others. Some would say it's benign neglect. Others would say that it's intentional. But I know that in attempts to work with the state of Missouri, the Department of Health and Senior Services in particular, the NAACP was stymied. We found that we did not have a partner in the work, but instead had yet another obstacle, who sought to use the name of a trusted civil rights organization to ensure that people received life-saving vaccine. It sounds good, but the truth is much better than a lie could ever be. Working in partnership means that you value the people and the organizations that you work with. You do that by forming an agreement and living up to the obligations necessary in that agreement. The Department of Health and Senior Services is under new management, new leadership. We're happy to see that. We look forward to what the future can bring, but we also understand that historic obstacles have prevented people from receiving health care. Medicaid expansion must be fully funded. The people mandated it, we wrote it into the Constitution, and now it's time for politicians to deliver. Sadly, though, violence has not known a time in Missouri where it did not exist. From the Broken Heart of America with Walter Johnson, a Missouri-born Harvard professor who will be speaking later this month at Missourians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, he suggests that this system of violence is dedicated to empire. We look forward to talking with him, not today, but in the future, and to bring home those lessons that history has already taught, simply being that in a state that was at one point a no man's land for Black people, some things still haven't changed. Perceptions on skin color, perceptions about the dignity of human beings remain here today. And sadly, it's our families, our communities, and our kids that have to bear the brunt of past sins that have yet to be reconciled. We ask for state leadership from the governor on down to ensure that the Attorney General prosecute those who are responsible for crime and not just the people thought to be criminals in Kansas City or St. Louis. That we here in mid-Missouri and rural Missouri are facing some of the same issues to healthcare, to gun violence, to a lack of education, and deserve better. Missouri deserves politicians that listen to the voters. We, as the voters, are not sent here to listen to politicians tell us what is good for us. After all, we sent them. Let the public mandate be what it is. The vote to expand Medicaid fully should be honored. The vote to determine that all Missourians be allowed to participate in elections should be honored. Jay Ashcroft's attempts to eliminate the ability of Missourians, no matter what color, to participate based on strict voter ID when no fraud has been proven, none, flies in the face of common sense. Why would you pay money to fix something that's not broken? The truth is that some people don't want everybody to vote. That's a terrible position for the Secretary of State to be in. Missouri earned its Jim Crow moniker because it refused to allow people of color, women, the aged, people with disabilities or perceived to have disabilities, and those who are the faithful, religious folks, from having the same protections as are afforded to other Americans in other states. In fact, Missouri is the most regressive civil rights state where you cannot sue the person who discriminates against you. What sense does that make? I thought that there was some remedy for every wrong. That's what the Constitution says. In Missouri, that has been the law and should be. We want you to work in your communities, in your families, in your churches, and through the NAACP to ensure that every person in Missouri who has a voice can be heard. And for those who are without a voice or without situation in which they can articulate the concerns that are affecting them, allow others to speak. We saw some mean-spirited bills. We saw fake criminal justice reform in this last legislative session. We saw the expansion of protections for law enforcement, even when we question the actions of those law enforcement agencies. We know that there are people who are under indictment in the Missouri General Assembly. There are 2 other people who have been accused of sexual misconduct with minors, some of them their own kids. Missouri's got a lot of problems. Jim Crow laws and legislation is one, but we need to get our moral calendar back on target. We need to check the date today, celebrate Juneteenth, go back tomorrow, and make sure that the work within our communities is being done. And we need to retain our voice to be able to do it. Join with the NAACP, your houses of worship, and other community organizations to ensure that not only we vote for people who support what we believe in, and that we live in a way that gives manifest to that same moral code, not only in our lives, but the lives of others, including our families, friends, and communities. We hope that you enjoy today, and from the NAACP, let me encourage you to grab a hold of this piece of Black history, this piece of American history, and say no more Jim Crow. Thank you. I'm Nimrod Chappell on behalf of the NAACP. You can reach us at www.monaacp.org, www.monaacp.org, or you can reach us at 844 NAACP help, 844 NAACP help. May God be with you.
Hi, my name's Denise Lieberman. I'm the Director and General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, and also serve as the Voting Rights Committee Chair for the Missouri State Conference of the NAACP. As we commemorate Juneteenth this year, we reflect on the historic struggles for freedom and the courageous freedom fighters that sacrificed so much in the fight for liberation. And we reflect on the fact that that fight remains ongoing today. We recognize the ongoing struggles for liberation today, none more foundational than the fight for the right to vote. Because the right to vote at its core is about basic human dignity, recognizing the rights of all people to have a say, a voice in their own destinies. The right to vote is also how we build power in communities whose voices have been purposely and intentionally silenced throughout history, to work towards fair representation and accountability, ultimately to work towards freedom. And this is a fight that requires all of us, because until all of us are free, none of us are free. And we do not have a democracy in this country if the right to vote is denied or abridged for some. And at its core, the fight for the right to vote is a liberation fight. It always has been. The right to vote has been wielded as a sword against people of color since the beginning of this country, as a way to deny them a voice, as a way to deny them power, as a way to deny them the ability to control their own destinies, to have freedom. And that fight continues to this day. It's notable that the first Juneteenth or Jubilee Day celebrations occurred in Texas, and here today in 2021, Texas is on the front pages of the news in an epic battle to restrict voting rights for voters of color in that state in unprecedented ways, by criminalizing activity at the polls, by limiting access to early voting, by making it illegal to transport people to the polls, by eradicating Sunday Souls to the Polls programs that were so historically valuable in communities of color, by eliminating drive-through voting that voters of color used to securely and safely cast a ballot during the pandemic, all targeted to the changing demographics of that state. And Texas is not alone. We know that there have been more than 360 restrictive voting measures introduced in 47 out of the 50 states this year in 2021, all a direct response to the robust and historic voter participation by voters of color, in particular in the 2020 election cycles. We have seen across this country concerted and intentional efforts to silence the voices of voters of color, passing legislation in states like Georgia, Florida, Arizona, now Texas, and other states around the country that are designed to silence the voices of voters of color, to impede the ability to gain power and fair representation, and indeed imperil access to freedom. And right here in Missouri, that battle continues as well. We have fought this year 15 years in a row efforts to enshrine strict discriminatory photo ID requirements to vote, requirements that disproportionately affect voters of color, in particular African-American voters in this state, who are twice as likely to lack a non-expired state-issued ID and will have greater difficulties navigating the hurdles necessary to get one. Limiting the forms of identification that voters have come to rely on, where no valid basis to do so, is nothing more than Jim Crow politics. Add to the fire attacks on the ballot initiative process. We live in a state that is heavily gerrymandered, where the legislators, representatives do not actually represent the will of the people. And for the people to be free, they have to be able to go around those lawmakers to get measures on the ballot when they are not being heard. Lawmakers have seen the success of those voices over the years and have likewise attacked the ability of grassroots citizens, grassroots organizations to have their voices heard through the ballot initiative process. And while these measures came very close to passing, but did not pass in the final week of Missouri's legislative session, lawmakers have asked for a special section on election reform. The House Elections Committee is calling it an interim committee, and states around the country are continuing their assault on the right to vote. We cannot allow that to happen. We will not allow that to happen, because the right to vote belongs to each and every one of us. They cannot take it away. They will continue to try. They will continue to attempt to silence the voices of America's Black and brown voters. We will not allow it to happen. One thing we can do, we can fight back at the state level, at our legislators, at our executive officers, the governor, the secretary of state, our state representatives, our state senators, and we can fight for transformative voting reform at the federal level by passing the For the People Act, which would make many of the legislative attacks and assaults on the right to vote we have seen this year illegal. It would make strict photo ID requirements illegal. It would restore access to the ballot after you have served your time in prison, something that does not currently exist in Missouri. It would guarantee access to early voting, voting by mail, and other options that are so critical for elderly voters, seniors, voters with disabilities, shift workers, low-wage workers, our most marginalized voters. It would ensure fair redistricting commissions. It would eradicate the power of dark money in politics to influence the outcomes. Voters should be deciding their leaders and their priorities. Leaders should not be picking their voters. We also must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act to restore the needed provisions of the Voting Rights Act, the legislation that our ancestors fought and died for, to its full protections, to ensure that no more voices get left behind. So please join our fight for the right to vote as we commemorate and recognize the epic battles for liberation and for freedom this Juneteenth. We know that this battle continues and we must all be in it together to fight for the right to vote.